Okay, so good morning, everybody. Today it is Daf Tet. We are starting the first line of Daf Tet at the end of the line. Achirim omrim iskupa mishameshet shetei reshuyot v'zman shepetach patuach kelifnim petach naul kilachutz. So what this is speaking about is what we had talked about before. It was mentioned in the Baraita before that you have this thing called iskupa, which is basically a threshold of some sort. This threshold, it said, when the door is closed on the threshold, it's considered like outside. When the door is open to the threshold is considered like inside. So exactly what this is talking about is, it's complicated. So like, let's say, the easiest way to imagine it is that in front of a house, when you walk up to a house, there's a part that's what you have to step up into the house, right? Okay. So even when the door is closed, there's still that step that you could step up and stand close to the door. It's just that you're not in yet. Yeah. So there's like a stoop. There's a stoop right in front of the door. Let's say that's a good example. So they're not exactly talking about that, but something like that. We're going to see. So, but what it basically means is it's something right outside the door. So it's inside. The walls are protruding. So there's a wall on your right and there's a wall on your left, but the door is in front of you. So you haven't entered yet. Okay, so that's kind of what you have to envision. So,
your house is a good example.
It isn't because, well, not yet, because in my house when you walk up, there's a roof
here.
On top.
Rabbi, here.
Yeah, this wouldn't. Yeah, actually, here this is a good example. So you have one wall on one side, one wall on the other side.
But no roof.
Okay, but there's no roof over you. Okay, so let's take that as that's a good example. Yeah, that would work. That would work. So imagine when the doors are open, that it's considered like part of the inside, and when the doors would be closed, it would be considered like part of the outside. Now, it's not exactly structured the same way as we're going to see, but it's a good example to use. So what's the problem here? The problem is like this: that the Gemara in the beginning is going to assume that what we're talking about in this is kupa. We're talking about a threshold of a mavoi. What's a mavoi? A mavoi is basically the way that Talmudic residence was set up is that people would have houses, and the houses would share a courtyard called a chatzer. Many chatzerot, you have a little diagram. Many chatzerot would open to a mavoi. A mavoi is sort of a way to get,
houses around.
Yeah. And so you would have a passageway that actually many chatzerot would open. It would be almost like you had these different enclosures with multiple houses inside, and in between these different courtyards would be a passageway that took people from their courtyard. So when you would come out of your house, you would be in your courtyard. You would go from your courtyard into this kind of alley. This alley would take you into the Reshut HaRabim, into this main thoroughfare. So, except enclosed. Yeah. So what is being spoken about here is the mavoi. A mavoi is walled on three sides. The only opening of the mavoi is the opening to exit the mavoi into the Reshut HaRabim, into the public domain. So what's the problem? From the Torah, Mina Torah, the three walls that it has, is enough that you should be able to carry inside the mavoi. You should be able to. The only problem is that since it opens right into the Reshut HaRabim, there's a concern that people are going to carry from this mavoi, which is technically a private domain, even though it's used by the public because it has three walls. They're going to walk right out into the public domain carrying stuff because they're not going to realize. So the rabbis made one of two tikkunim to allow a person to carry in the mavoi. One is called lechi, which means that there's a stick on the side of the wall that protrudes from the side of the wall at the end of this. So imagine a passageway that has three walls, and at the end, it's just open. Okay, so where that opening is, they would have a little post or stick on the side to remind you, don't go any further than here, don't carry out of here. That was one way that they would solve the problem. The other way they would solve the problem is called korah. Korah is that they would instead put a cross beam across the top. So either they would have a stick, a vertical stick, at the opening of the alleyway to tell you not to carry into the main area, into the public area, or they would have the crossbeam to tell you not to carry past the crossbeam. Okay? Now this lechi, this stick or post at the side of the wall, was in what we would call the iskupa. It was in the area that is the threshold. So when the doors are closed, you wouldn't even necessarily see this because it's on the other side of the doors. When the doors are open, you would see it, but it's at the threshold. So if you would imagine that this is the threshold again, so it would be like where the plaques are, where the memorial plaques are on the side there is where you would see where the lechi would be. Okay, where the stick would be, to remind you, don't go out of here. Now obviously this is not a mavoy, this is not an alleyway, this is just a regular building, but I'm just using it as an example. So so what the Gemara is saying is like this. That there's a problem, because in the case of a mavoy, what is it? So the Gemara is assuming we're talking about a mavoy, an alley that has this opening on the end and has a lechi, it has a stick or a post that allows you to carry inside. And it says that iskupa, that threshold, when the doors are open, is considered like part of the mavoy. It's considered like part of the area you can carry in. But there's a problem. The afal gav delet lechi. But that's saying even though it doesn't have a lechi. In other words, why? Because technically speaking, you can only go up to where the lechi is. So if you would imagine, for instance, that there is a post right under where the memorial plaque is, you can only carry up to that post. You can't carry next to the post or past it. So if we're saying that when the doors are open, that entire threshold area is considered like part of the enclosed area, that wouldn't be true, because the lechi, that stick, is in that enclosed area, and next to that lechi you can't carry. You can only carry up to it, but not include it. And you would actually need, if you wanted to carry in the threshold, you would need another lechi, another stick, at the very outer edge of it, to allow you to carry in that threshold.
Why not just put the first lechi?
Yeah, why not? Exactly. Right, you could, I guess in theory you could, but they're talking about how they would actually do it. So how they would actually do it. So now the Gemara says, but what about the other lechi that you need? That they said that part inside the door, which that's what they're calling the threshold, inside the door, would require another lechi. It would require another stick to allow it. And I think the reason why they put the lechi is because when the doors are open, you don't see the walls of the threshold, so you wouldn't see the stick. That's why they would put it at the inner edge of that threshold, is where they would put the stick, so you would see it. See, now when the doors are closed, you wouldn't see it at all. When the doors are open, it would be right on the edge of the threshold, so you would see it. Because you wouldn't want to go up to the threshold. They would stop you. In other words, it would be flush with the threshold. That's where you would stop when you were carrying. Now, yeah, when the doors are open. Well, I'm not sure, but either way. But let's assume, just for argument's sake, that's the way that they worked. So, that's the problem. So maybe you're going to say this, that threshold maybe doesn't have 4x4 tefachim. And we said that any area that doesn't have 4x4 tefachim is not really considered a significant area. So perhaps you have this one lechi there, and this one stick on the side that is normally permits you to carry only up to the stick. But since the part past the stick is less than 4x4 tefachim anyway, maybe we don't care. We just let you carry in that little threshold area too. But that's not true, because that he said that threshold area, even though it has less than 4x4 tefachim, it's a small area, still the lechi, the stick that is flush with it, that's against it, or that's at the inner edge of it, does not cover it. It only covers up to the stick, but you can carry in the threshold area beyond the stick, or even right next to the stick. You wouldn't be able to carry. So therefore, we have to change the case. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Hachab iskupat mavoyaskinam. We're talking about an alleyway that has this, or whatever you want to call it, this three sides enclosed alleyway. The mavoy is what we're talking about here. Chetzio mikora, v'chetzio eno mikora. That v'keruyo kelape penim. Okay, so what we're talking about here is not a mavoy that has the first type of way of fixing it, which is the lechi, the post that's vertical. But instead we're talking about a one that has the horizontal cross beam on top to remind you not to carry. And the halacha is actually that when you have the cross beam going over the top, you're allowed to carry under the cross beam. You're allowed to. Why? Because the principle by which the crossbeam works is different than the principle by which the vertical post works. The vertical post works only to remind you not to carry past that point. But the horizontal beam is actually considered like a roof. And there's a principle, pi tikra yored v'sotem, which means that whenever you have a roof on top of you, for example, in the houses in the development that I live in that have, when you walk up to the threshold, you're under that partial roof, pi tikra yored v'sotem means that it's as if the roof comes down and it's a fourth wall. That's different. So that we're saying the same thing here with the korah, that this cross beam is considered like it's enclosing you. So even if you're right under it, you're inside the enclosure, according to that, and you'd be able to carry under it. So it's saying this is a place where it's half cross beamed. In other words, the cross beam covers half the threshold, but not the other half. So why is that significant? Because for the following reason, and it's a little confusing. Because if the roof were completely covered, okay, and we're assuming it's 4 tfachim in size, because that was, let's say, the standard. So if that were the case, then it would be a full roof and it would be considered enclosed. So what are we talking about then? We're talking about a cross beam that's less than 4 tfachim in its width, let's say, or length. In other words, it doesn't span. If this is the top, there's an open area here. There's an open space in the roof here, and then there's just a board here. Okay, so under this board is good. Past the board is not good.
Next to it.
Right, next to it is not going to be good. So, but under it would be good. Now, if the board were an entire 4 tfachim, it would be considered like a regular roof, and it would always work to enclose the area. But since it's not, so what do we say? When the doors are open to the mavoi, the door is open to the alleyway, so that partial roofing is considered significant because the rabbis made it significant to allow you to carry in the alleyway. But when the doors are closed, there's no alleyway anymore because the doors are closed. That means the alleyway is now completely enclosed. There are 4 walls around the alleyway when you close the doors. So what do you have? A stick over the threshold? That's not good. That doesn't do anything. In other words, it only functions when there's a 3-walled mavoi. And at the end of the 3-walled mavoi is the special crossbeam that the rabbi said could be considered like it encloses the place. But when the doors are actually closed and the place is enclosed, all you have is a stick now. It doesn't serve any function. So the fact that you're standing under a stick doesn't allow you to carry. So that's why they said when the doors are open, since that cross beam is allowing you to carry under it and even inside the entire alleyway, then it's fine. But when the doors are closed, inside the alleyway is now you're allowed to carry inside the alleyway now because you closed the doors. It's completely enclosed. But now all that stick is just a stick. It's not a roof anymore. It's just a stick over a threshold outside. Now, if that stick over the threshold were 4 tfachim in area, so then it would be considered like another private space. But since it's not, it only functions when it's functioning to allow people to carry in the alleyway. And when it's not needed for that because you close the doors, all it is a stick hanging over your head. Okay, so that's basically the way that they answer it. So that's why when the doors are open, it's good, and when the doors are closed, it's not good.
Would it be a private space if the doors were open, if there were only 3 walls and a roof?
And a real roof out there?
And the order, and in effect, you had a roof.
Yeah, I mean, if in fact you had a roof, yeah, then it would be considered like like a real roof that comes down and closes off that 4th wall. Right. That could work. That would create a 4th wall. But here we're talking about a stick that isn't a 4th wall, that isn't the dimensions to be really considered a roof. So it only works under the rabbinic enactment that it's there because the alleyway is open. But when the alleyway is closed, now all you have is a stick, and just putting a stick over an open area does not make a roof. Okay, that's how he resolves it. Okay, Rav Ashi says no. Leolam biskupat bayit taskinan. Let's forget about this whole mavoi thing. Let's forget that we're talking about a mavoi, that we're talking about an alleyway. We're just talking about a house. Ukigon shekira b'shtei korot she'en bezo arba'a v'en bezo arba'a. So again, go back to the thresholds. Okay, but and there's a roof over this threshold, but we're talking about a house threshold. Like a regular house has a threshold and it has a roof extending over it. But this roof over the threshold is not a solid roof, but it's made of 2 boards. Each board by itself doesn't have 4 tefachim. So it covers, let's say, 3 tefachim, and this one covers 3 tefachim. And in between them is less than 3. So we have a principle of lavud, that when there's less than 3 tefachim between 2 things, it's considered all one thing. So that would mean that the 3 tefachim and the 3 tefachim are going to combine, because they're close together. They're not touching, but they're close together. The only problem is, so when it's set up like that, they would be considered like a 6 tefach, or even a 9 tefach, or whatever, a 6 tefach roof. And a 6 tefach roof is considered to come down and close the area. So if you have a threshold in front of your house, and the threshold has a roof over it, so for sure we consider it closed as long as there were 3 walls. Then the 4th wall is closed. Now, if the roof is not made of 1 solid piece, but it's made of 2 pieces, each of which is less than 4 tefachim in its width, So therefore, each of which is actually physically covering, let's say, 3 tefachim and 3 tefachim, and they're separated like this. But we still look at it all as one thing. So we'll still look at it like there's 6 tefachim of a roof there. And we can still look at it as closing that open side. But if the door closes in between those 2 boards, then that means that when you close the door, all you have is that 3 tefachim board covering your thresholds. Because the other 3 tefachim board that was combining with it is now blocked by the door that's in between them. So now all you have is the 3 tefachim board. Is a 3 tefachim board big enough to be considered a roof that it's going to close that 4th side? No. So that's what Rav Ashi tries to learn it. Okay? So that's what he says. It's very complicated, but do they have a picture of it there to help? Yeah. So show the picture. We'll thank Rabbi Steinsaltz for this lovely picture. It's better than the 1969 Steinsaltz pictures, that's for sure. See what it looks like? That's the bottom diagram where you have that threshold and you have the 2 boards. So the door closes between the boards. So when you're on the outside, if its door is open, so you have an entire 6 tefachim, let's say, that's being covered by those 2 boards combined. But when the door closes in that space between them, so all you have is 3 tefachim of a roof on the outside. And that 3 tefachim roof is not a korah. It's not part of the rabbinic enactment of a mavui helping us with an alleyway. It's just the threshold of a house. So it must be at least 4 tefachim, the roof, in order to be considered an enclosed place, in order for the threshold to be considered enclosed. And that's how we conclude this particular halacha. So we said that if you have a threshold that is 10 tefachim tall, and it's 4 by 4 tefachim, it can be considered its own area. It's even its own reshut hayachid, its own private domain. This supports the position of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi. The Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, Omer Aya Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi said that Rabbi Meir used to say, Kol makom shetam motzei bet reshuyot v'hen reshut achat, kegon amud b'reshut yechid gavoa yud v'rachav daled, asur lechatef alav gezer mishum tel b'reshut harabim. Rabbi Meir had a very novel position. What he said was, and this is the relevance here, that if you were to have a threshold that is 4 by 4 tefachim, in its area, and it is 10 tefachim tall, and it's enclosed, that you couldn't carry from that threshold into your house, according to Rabbi Meir. Why? Because there's a problem when you have 2 reshuyot hayachid, 2 private domains together. Why? According to Rabbi Meir, he says actually, if you have something that's the dimensions of a reshut hayachid in your house, you can't carry from it in and out in your house. For instance, like the baskets that we talked about, that are 10 tefachim tall, and they have an area inside of 4 by 4 tefachim. They're considered like a private domain in and of themselves, those baskets, right? So he would say, you can't rest objects on those baskets. Why? You can't rest if you have an amud, if you have a pillar inside a private domain. That is the dimensions of a private domain itself. That's 10 tefachim tall and 4 by 4 tefachim. You wouldn't be able to put anything on it. That would make many tables you wouldn't be allowed to use, according to Rabbi Meir. Why? He said, Gezerah mishum tel b'reshut harabim. Because if you do that in your house, Rabbi Meir says, then what if you're outside? And you're outside, you're going to move something from a public domain onto something that's considered a private domain. Like, let's say you have an object on the ground, and there's a pillar there that actually is a reshut hayachid. It's actually considered a private domain because it has 4 by 4 in its area, tefachim, and it's 10 tefachim tall. And you take your bag that's sitting in the public domain, and you put it on that pillar. So what did you just do? You just moved it from the public domain to the private domain. Why are you not accustomed to being concerned about that? Because in your house, you do it all the time. Okay? So Rabbi Meir said, and even within a reshut hayachid, you shouldn't move something onto something. You shouldn't place something on something which is like a reshut hayachid, because you're going to get confused when you're in the public domain and think, oh, here's a pillar or here's a something in the public domain that I can just rest my stuff on, and really you just put it onto a private domain and you're not sensitive to it because in your house you're not sensitive to it. That is what Rabbi Meir says. Of course, the halacha does not follow that, or we would have a lot of trouble in our private domains. Now we move to a new Mishnah on Tet Amud Bet, which is a totally different subject and will be a little bit lighter for us for a while. Mishnah says, Lo yeshev adam lefnei sapar samuch lemincha ad sheyitpalel. A person should not sit in front of the barber to get a haircut when it's mincha time until he says mincha. Obviously, the reason is that he not get involved in his haircut and forget to do mincha. Lo yikanes adam lamerchatz. He shouldn't go to the bathhouse. V'lo laburskin. He shouldn't go to the tannery. okay, for where they tan hides. V'lo le'echol, and he shouldn't sit down to a meal. V'lo ladin, and he shouldn't start a court case at this time. Meaning, this is all things you shouldn't do before you pray mincha. Once the time of mincha is close, samuch lemincha, because we're concerned that a person will get involved in these activities, they will drag on, and he will forget to say mincha. And if a person started in mafsikin, he doesn't have to stop. In other words, if you sat down to eat either before the time of mincha, or even if you forgot and you started eating a meal, or you started doing one of these activities, be'isur, that's what Tosafot says, afilu hitchila be'isur. Even if you started because you forgot that mincha time had started already and you went and got a haircut, you don't have to stop in the middle, okay? You just finish up and you say mincha afterwards. But ideally, well, that's the discussion in the Gemara, we didn't get to that yet. So we don't want to preempt ourselves. So then it says mafsikin lekriyat shema and mafsikin letfilah, that we interrupt for kriyat shema and we don't interrupt for tefillah. As Rashi is going to say, as the Gemara is going to explain, and as Rashi says here, they explain this cryptic statement at the end of the Gemara. So we don't have to understand it yet. What does it mean we interrupt for the Shema but we don't interrupt for prayer? We'll understand it later. So now, hi samuch lemincha. Which samuch lemincha are we talking about here? We assume that samuch lemincha means half an hour before the time of mincha starts. But there are two mincha times. There's something called mincha gedolah. And the way to remember which one's mincha gedolah and which one's mincha ketana is that mincha gedolah, the big mincha, is a longer period of time. It starts at 12:30 in a perfect day. Now we talked about sha'ot zmaniyot many times, that the way that they calculate times in halacha is not by the regular clock, but it's by taking the daylight hours and dividing them into 12 even parts. So for instance, now chatzot, midday, is somewhere around 12:55 or something like that, not 12 o'clock. But that's because daylight doesn't start till 7 something, and sunset is around 6:30 is sunset. So we divide up that time, and starting from 7:15 or whatever sunrise is, we calculate the times for that given day. But just for simplicity's sake, we're going to imagine a day where the sun rises at 6 a.m. and the sun sets at 6 p.m. So we can say 12 o'clock and 12:30 without having to worry. But technically that's not right. Now, so it's at 12:30 on a perfect day is mincha gedolah. That's the earliest time of mincha. That would mean you couldn't sit down to a meal starting at 12 o'clock. So forget your lunch break. Okay? Or getting a haircut during that time. If you're telling me that it's mincha gedolah, why do you have to refrain from doing these activities starting from 12:30? I mean, because remember, on a perfect day where mincha time is starting at 12:30, you have until 6 o'clock to say mincha. So what's the problem? So you have plenty of time. So you must mean mincha ketana. What's mincha ketana? Mincha ketana is 3:30 on the perfect clock. 3:30 was around the time, according to the Rambam, was around the time that they normally offered the afternoon korban. According to Rashi, that was the latest time they would really offer the afternoon korban. And there were some people who actually would pray both mincha gedolah and mincha ketana. There were people who would do both. One of them is a voluntary tefillah. But the point is that mincha gedolah and mincha ketana, these are the two times that are referred to as the time of mincha. The latter one is more of a crunch time. There you have only 2.5 hours left to go. When it's 12:30, you have 5.5 hours. That seems like plenty of time to get a haircut for most people. Unless, I guess, you're really getting a perm or something like that. I guess they're really involved. But otherwise, it shouldn't take much time. Right. In my case, I could do it until I could be there at 5:45 and still make mincha. So therefore we're talking about mincha ketana. So what's the point? But then we have another problem with the Mishnah, because it says if they started, they shouldn't interrupt. But that would seem to contradict what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said. Because according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, once it comes to 3:30, you're not allowed to taste anything. Meaning, just like in the morning before shacharit, you're not supposed to eat anything before you pray. So too at mincha, once it becomes 3:30, according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, you're not allowed to taste anything or do any, get involved in any eating until you've prayed mincha. So this would seem to contradict that, because this is saying that it could be 3:30 and you can actually sit down and eat. Or do any of these activities, not that you're supposed to, but meaning even though you are doing it, you wouldn't have to interrupt. And according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, you would definitely have to interrupt. Every bite that you take, you're not allowed to be doing. It's an illicit biting. So therefore, what do we say? So let's go back to the first interpretation. We can't be talking about the later mincha, because that's cutting it too close. And the Mishnah wouldn't say you don't have to interrupt. It would say if you started eating at that time, you should stop and say mincha, because it's cutting it too close. So we must be talking about mincha gedolah. So what about the problem that that none of these activities are quite long enough to last 5.5 hours. Tisporet ben Elasha, because we're talking about the Tisporet of ben Elasha. This was a special type of haircut that the Kohen Gadol would get, that Ben Elasha went and learned. He was the one who would who was the expert in how to. He spent a lot of money actually to go to a beauty school to learn how to do this haircut. It was a haircut where the end of one hair would meet the root of the next hair, so it was some kind of very, very closely layered and very closely cropped haircut that the Kohen Gadol would, because the Kohen Gadol would get a haircut very often. He would get a haircut every day, and because of the prohibition of growing out your hair long. So he would get the Kohen Gadol would get a constant haircut. So this haircut was a precise art. And because it was a precise art, it would be something that took a very long time. Okay, so we should get some of our hairdressers, maybe when they want to learn this, and they could advertise it and get business. So why did it say that you can't go into the bathhouse? I mean, at 12:30, it's going to take you 5.5 hours. What kind of shower is this? Why is it taking so long? Because that means somebody who's going for the full spa treatment. Basically, he's going for the going for the spa, he's going for the sauna, he's going for the whole thing. So because it's a full spa treatment, it's possible that it's going to drag on very long. And when it says you can't go into the tannery, it means a large tannery where you're going to get really involved. And when it says that you can't sit down to a meal at 12:30, it means not to a big meal like a wedding or something like that. And when it says you shouldn't sit down to a court case, it means to the beginning of a court case. In other words, that you're starting a new court case and you don't know where it's going to go. It could be a very long, drawn-out court case. Like anybody knows, when you go to a meeting for the first time with people that you've never met with before, you usually clear your schedule, right? Because you know that you have to leave yourself a lot of time because you don't know where the situation is going to go. So that's the way it is in court. Okay, so that's the first answer. The first answer is that we are indeed talking about the first mincha. We're talking about the long mincha, 12:30, and that would mean at 12 o'clock, samuch mincha, you would have to stop doing these activities. But the activities you're not allowed to do are big activities that are by their nature very, very involved, and quantitatively very, very involved. Rav Acha bar Yaakov says no. Leolam b'tisporet didan. I disagree. Really, we're just talking about regular haircut here. We're not talking about some fancy Kohen Gadol haircut. Why would the Mishnah have to tell us about a fancy Kohen Gadol haircut? Lechatchila amay lo yeshev. So then why shouldn't you go for a haircut if there's really no problem? Gezerah shema yishaver azug, because it's always possible that the barber's scissors are going to break. And what's going to happen? You're going to sit there with half a haircut. You're not going to leave, right? He's going to have to go get them fixed or get new ones, and you're going to be sitting there because nobody's going to leave with half a haircut. And you can't go into a bathhouse not just for a full spa treatment, even for just the sweating treatment, just the sauna. You can't go in. Why? Because there's always the possibility that you're going to pass out from it. And then you won't be able to, it's going to make you faint. And then you won't be able to pray mincha. And you can't go into any tannery, not just a large tannery like was said before, but any tannery. Why? Because it's always possible that you're going to go in, even just to look around this small tannery, and you're going to notice something going wrong, and it's going to be a crisis, and you're going to have to solve it. So you should pray mincha before you go looking, because you might be looking for trouble, as they say. Okay, and when it says you can't eat a meal, it means even a small meal. So then lechatchila amay, but if it's a small meal, what's the problem? Why can't you eat a small meal before mincha? Dil ba'atela amshuche, because it might drag on. Who knows? The meal could drag on. So therefore, even though we're talking about very early, we're talking about 12 o'clock, we have the concern. And you know what? When it says you can't sit down to judgment, it means even to conclude a judgment that already started. But so why can't you do it then? If it's only going to take a minute? The answer is because you never know. Maybe you're going to find a problem in the judgment and you're going to have to start over again. So in other words, each of these situations is not necessarily a situation that by its nature is very protracted or involved, but it's a situation that could invite problems or complications. In every case, there's the possibility maybe the scissors will break. There's the possibility maybe the meal will drag on. The possibility maybe you're going to find a problem at the tannery and you're going to get distracted. So in all of these situations, there's a big maybe. And because there's a maybe, unlike the previous view said you're getting involved in a protracted and very demanding task, and it's likely to overrun the time of mincha. This is saying no, it's really not likely to overrun the time of mincha, but it's a gzerah. It's an enactment, a rabbinic protection that you shouldn't do something that has the possibility or potential of becoming complicated and interfering with mincha. Now, there's a bit of a machloket here. Tosafot views the, in terms of what the halacha is. So the Shulchan Aruch, the Rambam, take the most stringent view. They say, you know what? We follow the view that this is talking about mincha gedolah, that it's talking about starting from around 12 o'clock or 12:30. Now it would be like around 12:30. And even a small meal shouldn't be started at that time. Even going for a haircut that's a regular haircut, even my haircut, shouldn't be started at that time because you never know. That's what the Rambam's view is. The Tosafot here brings their view is the most lenient view of all, which is or more or less not actually the most lenient of all, but one of the more lenient views that basically says you can eat a small meal until 3:30. But you can't eat a big meal, okay, at 12 o'clock. So you can't. So they go with the first view. The first view being that unless you say mincha first, that you can't do one of the big activities, one of the very involved ones. If you're going for a perm or you're going for the full spot treatment, you can't do that at 12 o'clock. But anything else you can do until it gets later. When it gets later, that's when you should pull back from doing the ordinary activities as well. So now we move. But the Shulchan Aruch, which is usually our view, is the one that says that, or at least the Sephardic view, is that starting even at 12 or 12:30, you shouldn't even have a small meal. The Ashkenazim follow the more lenient view that says that for a big or involved meal, that's true, but for anything else until 3:30, really, you should be allowed to do it. So now we move forward. You said that when you start this, you don't have to interrupt. So what's the beginning of a haircut? It's when they put that cover on you to prevent the hair from getting on your clothes. Yeah, we all, the cover that they put on you. I guess they did that back then too. Yeah, the apron. So what's the beginning of going to the bathhouse? That's when you take off your apron. In other words, the first piece of clothing that they put on you for the haircut means you started the haircut already. You don't have to say, I just realized it's time for mincha. Sorry, I have to go. Once they put the apron on you, you started already. If you're sitting in the waiting room waiting for the haircut, you didn't start yet. Once you sit, okay? Similarly, when you go to the merchatz, what does it mean to start your bathhouse activity? It's once you took off the outer layer. So you could say, I only took off my jacket, maybe I can just put it back on. Once you start undressing to go into the bathhouse, you started already. Or maybe what's considered starting going to the tannery, that you wouldn't have to interrupt after that point? When you put on the apron that they would wear to go into the tannery. In other words, the first action that you take, which is part of the routine when you get involved in these activities, is considered to have started it. It doesn't have to be that you're deep in the middle of it already, but once you've begun it, you've begun it. What's considered beginning the meal? Rav says once you wash your hands for hamotzi. That when you take off your belt, because in those days they would take off their belt because they tied a very, very tight belt. They would take off their belt in order to eat because they would let their gut hang out, I guess, and they would be more comfortable. Again, it's not a machloket because in Babylonia the custom was that they didn't have these tight belts. The tight belts were in Israel. So in Israel, they would loosen their belts. In Babylonia, they had the washing hands was the measure of. I'm sorry, the other way around. The people of Babylonia were the ones who would tighten the belt. The people in Israel were the ones who didn't have the custom of tightening their belt, tying their belt very tight. So they would just consider the beginning of a meal washing your hands, which is what we would consider the beginning of a meal. Washing your hands, we wouldn't consider the belt because we don't do the belt thing anymore, even though that was what they did in Babylonia. Amar Abai says, "Hane chavrin bavlae leman damar tfilat avit rishut kevan desharale hemyenei lo mitarachinan le." So he said that the Babylonians, the Babylonians who have this custom of tying their belt very tightly. So according to the view that tfilat arvit is reshut, according to the view that praying in the evening prayer is optional, is reshut. So once they have untied their belts, we don't require them to pray anymore. In other words, being reshut means you don't have to do heroic measures. And since they already untied the tight belt and they're relaxing for the night, we don't require them. It would be like today, once you get in your pajamas, you don't have to go back and pray arvit. Now we don't say that because now we consider arvit like a chovah. We treat it like an obligatory prayer. But in those days where there was a machloket, whether it was obligatory or it was voluntary, so you were supposed to do it. Even if it was voluntary, you were supposed to do it. That's what the Tosafot emphasizes again and again. You're supposed to do it. But if it was a big inconvenience, you didn't. So, for example, if you had already put on your pajamas, that would be the analogy to this taking off of the belt. You didn't have to do it. Uleman amar chova. But according to the ones that say that arvit is obligatory, and that's how we practice, even though in theory, halachically, we agree that it's voluntary, but in practice we treat it as chova. So mitarchin anle, we still require them to put their belt back and to pray. So vahat filat mincha deluchulei alma chovahi utznani midchilu en mafsikin. But wait a second, I don't understand. When it comes to mincha, right? And when it comes to mincha, we say that the person who started eating doesn't have to interrupt. They don't have to inconvenience themselves by interrupting their meal. They can finish their meal and pray afterwards. So why is it that the Babylonians, you say, once they take off their belts, they're already involved in eating? And they don't have to interrupt I'm sorry, if it's chovah, that they have to interrupt for tfilat arvit. That they would have to go put their belt back on and they would have to go pray. So if they sat down to eat and they unbuckled their belts, and they're about to eat, and they started the meal, and they realized, we have to do arvit. So if arvit is a chovah, if it's a required prayer, they would have to buckle their belt again and go pray. But in mincha, which is definitely an obligatory prayer, there's no argument about whether mincha is obligatory. There we say that if the person started eating, they don't have to interrupt and go pray. So why are we treating mincha more leniently when mincha should be the same? I mean, if it's an obligatory prayer, it's an obligatory prayer. So va'amar Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Chanina said mishatir chagoro. Rabbi Chanina said that from the time that they unbuckle their belts, right? And so that's considered that they started the meal already, and yet we don't require them to interrupt for mincha. So we go to Yud Amud Aleph, Hatam lo shechicha shechrut, acha shechicha shechrut. The answer is that in mincha time, we're not concerned that the person is going to become drunk. In other words, he's going to be drinking, and then he's going to forget to do mincha altogether, because it's the middle of the day. So he's not going to do that. So we say, you know what? You already started eating, finish your meal, and then do mincha. But at Arvit, the person's relaxing for the night, they have a little nightcap, a little wine, they start drinking, and then before you know it, they forget Arvit. So that's why we're more stringent. If Arvit were obligatory, which let's assume for a minute that it is, so then we would be more strict actually about Arvit, because we would say that Arvit is a time where people are basically winding down. So there's a likelihood that they're going to drink. Now it's interesting because Tosafot raises the objection here, wait a second, the whole reason we don't have Birkat Kohanim at Mincha is because people drink, right? Because of Kohanim. So he says, good point, but that's because for a Kohen, even if he has only a little bit to drink, okay, we don't think a person is going to get drunk in the afternoon, or a Kohen is going to get drunk in the afternoon. But the Kohen, even if he has just a little bit to drink, he can't do Birkat Kohanim. That's the problem. Whereas here we're talking about somebody who's really letting loose. So he's not going to do that in the middle of the day. He might do that in the evening, though. Okay, and then we say inam alternatively, but mincha kevan de kvi Allah zimna mirtat velo atel lemifsha. Arvit kevan de kula leli azman arvit lo mirtat vatel lemifsha, which makes a lot of sense. In other words, when it comes to mincha, a person knows there's a deadline, so he's going to say, you know what? As soon as I finish eating, I shouldn't have started this meal, but as soon as I finish eating, I'd better do mincha because I'm going to run out of time. A person with arvit, it's all night. So he says, I'll finish eating, and then I'll watch the debates, and then I'll watch the analysis, and then I'll have some ice cream, and then I'll do this, and it's 3 a.m, and he falls asleep. Okay, so the person is, it's much easier to push off Arvit because there's no deadline. So that's why they said, if Arvit is chovah, if Arvit is an obligatory prayer, as soon as you realize you start, even if you started eating, you got to interrupt and you got to do it because we're worried that you're going to push it off and you're going to forget. So Matkifla Rav Sheshet, we're just going to do this last part. Rav Sheshet raised an objection. Is it really that big of a deal to tie your belt? I mean, what are they talking about? Why are they making such a big deal of tying the belt? So tie the belt. He says, and moreover, why do you even require them to tie their belt? Why don't you just say to them, okay, you started, I understand you don't want to retie your belt for whatever reason, so get up and pray. Why is the belt such a big deal? Why is it such an inconvenience? So the answer is, Mishum Hikon Likrat Elohecha Yisrael, because it says, prepare to greet your God, O Israel. And then the Gemara is now going to go on to talk about some different wardrobe enhancements or wardrobe habits that the rabbis had when they would pray. But the point is that since the proper and mechubad way of dressing was with the belt closed, they would not pray with their belt untied. They would only pray with their belt tied. tied, because they didn't want to present themselves before God in a way that was not at their best. So even though it's true, it wouldn't be an invalidation of the prayer to pray without their belt. They didn't feel that it was appropriate to pray that way, and therefore, if a person undid the belt, they would put the belt back on before praying. Now, the Tosafot talks here about the gartel. Basically, he says that it seems from here that a person has to wear a belt when they pray, and of course that is the custom of Hasidim that they do that. And he talks about how nowadays the reason why this wasn't a practice even in his time was because they had pants.
Right. They had tunics then.
Right. So in the times of the Gemara, that they had a toga or whatever, so they, you had a problem of liboro et irva, which is there has to be a separation between the heart and the genital area, the private area. So that's done by a belt that they would tie around them, like the gartel that the Hasidim use. We have regular pants that distinguish between our upper body and our lower when all the time. So one could argue that if somebody's wearing like one of those Moroccan jalaba, the jalaba that's very long, that it's like a toga, so that would be a problem to pray without any kind of belt on, because you don't have any separation. Now it depends, because if you're just wearing that would be a problem. If you're wearing pants under it, and it's just a costume, it might be okay. But these are issues that are raised right here in the Gemara. Shabbat Shalom.